What is up guys, Blue Spooky here. Please be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you end up enjoying this video, doing any of those helps the video to do well and the channel to do well, and ensures I can continue making this content daily for many years to come. If you guys have any thoughts about the video, please be sure to share them in the comments below, as I always read all of them, even if I don't always get the chance to respond to them all. Last but not least, if you guys would like to support the channel further than you already do just by watching, liking, subscribing, and all that, please be sure to check out the join button somewhere around the subscribe button. If you click on that, it will let you join the channel membership for as low as $2 a month, and you get special access to emoticons you can use when you comment, and special icons that appear next to your name as well. No content will ever be locked behind the paywall. It's just something extra you can do if you'd like to support the channel further. Without further ado though guys, we'll get right into the stories, and I hope you guys enjoy them. Have a great day. This happened 2 years ago, and it still puts me on edge thinking about it. My husband, myself, and our then 2-year-old daughter moved to Tennessee to get a fresh start on life. We were all exhausted after a long drive and just wanted to get out the mattresses. My parents, who lived in Tennessee already, were helping us to unload as well. Naturally, all the neighbors in our apartment complex came out and said hello to us. That's when we met Ben. Right away, I got creepy vibes off him. Our daughter, who to this day is still way too friendly to strangers, even hid behind my husband and visibly cringed. We made small talk, but we mainly paid more attention to unloading our things than chatting with our newly acquired neighbors. My dad later told me that at one point, he came back to the truck and saw Ben staring at our daughter. My dad called him out, and when Ben denied it, my husband eventually told him to go fuck off. Later that night, me and my husband were going through our stuff. Our daughter was staying the night at my parents' house. It was about 10:30 p.m. or so when we heard a knock at the door. Thinking that it was the pizza I'd ordered, my husband opened the door, only to be surprised when there stood Ben instead. He asked us if we needed any help. Him showing up at our door so late at night, even for a friendly neighbor, was just creepy. Before we could even tell him to get lost though, he demanded a cigarette. Not only was he a total weirdo, he was also just being plain rude. Neither of us smoked, and when we told him that, he got a bit angry and started screaming and yelling at my husband. He began to pound on the wall as well. This guy was completely unhinged. Thankfully, our landlord lived right across the way from us at the time and came out to tell him off. As Ben sauntered away, our landlord explained to us that he was the residential pest and suffered from various mental issues. Overall, he was harmless though, as long as he took his meds. Yeah, because that's exactly what you want to hear your first night in a new place. After that, we kind of fell into the new place and settled in without any further disruptions. We had crazy schedules and would sometimes work graveyard shifts. I would get home around midnight and would see Ben standing outside the apartment buildings. He would always seem to be staring at me. I would just try to ignore him, mainly because I was just too tired and wanted to get to bed ASAP. He would always try to ask me for cigarettes when he could catch me, and I kept telling him I didn't smoke. My husband said he did the same thing to him. We would change up our work times just to throw off Ben a little. At first it worked out, but then Ben started to pester us during the day instead. On our days off, we'd take our kid to the park or the mountains. One time, Ben asked to come with us. He said he was really great with kids, and we should trust him alone with our daughter. I really should have just had my husband deck him in the face right then and there. When we came back, he was sitting in our parking spot and said he was making sure no one parked in it while we were away. He then ran up and tried to hug our daughter. She screamed and clung onto me for dear life. I rushed her into the house, while my husband finally snapped and really gave him an earful, telling him to leave us alone. We told the landlord, but they played the whole mental issues card again. And look, I get it. Mental illness is never fun to deal with, but he was constantly harassing and terrifying my daughter. We have a duty to protect our family. It got to the point where my daughter couldn't even go outside because she was afraid the bad man would be out there. We threatened to cut our lease if something wasn't done about it. I began talking to my other neighbors, and everyone seemed to have the same type of experience. One of my neighbors even told me that he and another neighbor had once saw Ben hiding and staring at some of the young girls wearing bathing suits and short shorts by the community pool. They chased him off and reported this to the landlord, but nothing was ever done. After about a month, things had quieted down. He wasn't spotted outside anymore. In fact, no one really saw him. We figured he'd moved away or something. Good riddance. We were thinking about moving in with my folks while we saved up the money for a real house. One night, I came home from work early. My husband was out of town for work, and my parents had taken our daughter to visit some family. I decided to play some Saints Row and relax after having just worked an 11-hour shift. I was deep into the game when someone knocked on the door. I looked and saw it was about 10 p.m. At this point, if anyone was coming over that late, they would have called or texted first. I got up to see who it was. Before I got to the door, though, it began to shake violently, and then I heard Ben screaming, "Open the goddamn door!" His heavy knocking turned into him slamming his shoulder against it. He was screaming like a deranged madman. I grabbed my phone and the sharpest knife we had from the kitchen. I did the hide in the closet. Cliché, I know, but if he managed to get in, at least there would be something in between us. I called 911, and they said my other neighbors had already called it in as well. It was only after I heard the sirens and the voices yelling outside that I felt safe to come out and see what was going on. I opened my door and saw a cop pinning Ben face down on the ground. The landlord was screaming at the cop to let him go, even shoved him. Both of them ended up being arrested. I gave my report, and each one of my neighbors backed up everything I said, even added in their own experiences. My sweet churchly neighbor called my husband and parents to let them know what was going on. She even let me stay with her and her family for the night. After what happened, I couldn't sleep at all, though. I kept thinking that at any moment, I would hear Ben's deranged screaming and pounding from outside. Turns out, Ben was a registered sex offender. Rumor has it the landlord was well aware, but willingly overlooked it, as Ben's family would slip him some extra money as long as he was allowed to stay there. That's why nothing was ever done about his behavior. It really makes me sick. Ben did take his meds, but he hadn't been on any of them for the past few months. He tried to tell the cops our daughter was his and that we kidnapped her, that I was having an affair with him. And crazy, right? The last thing I heard, he'd been placed in some institution. I'm not sure if it was a prison or a psych ward. The landlord was fired and pretty much chased out of town. Good riddance. We were offered 3 months rent-free for our trouble, but that was ultimately our breaking point. We sold off most of our belongings and moved in with my parents. I'm happy to say we have a house now, and our daughter is not afraid to go outside anymore. And yes, we did check all our neighbors for red flags. My mother was 14 in 1986 when this happened. She lived in China at the time with her parents and younger brother. It was deep into winter when this occurred, and a temperature drop into the negatives was occurring. Snow was falling in thick layers on the ground. It was around 10 p.m. or so. My mother had just finished up her classes, and by then it was already dark. Bear in mind, in China, it's normal for young students to walk home alone without a parent or guardian. About 10 minutes after getting off the bus, she began walking through an old marketplace to get to her apartment. The marketplace was completely quiet and deserted at this time of night. There were also no lampposts around. It was hard for my mom to properly see where she was going, but she had traveled this route several times before, so she was familiar with the area and knew her way back home. As she was walking, though, my mother started to get this feeling that someone was lurking off in the darkness of the marketplace. She tried to shrug it off, but the apprehension persisted. She continued to hear her feet crunching on the white snow. But when she suddenly stopped, she could hear a second pair of feet crunching the snow behind her. My mom panicked but continued forward and pretended she hadn't noticed anything. She thought maybe it was another student making their way back to their living quarters. This thought made sense, but it didn't stop her from moving faster. She began to pick up her pace. The crunching snow behind her also began to speed up as well. My mother couldn't handle the fear anymore and started running. The thick snow made it difficult for her to run away quickly. She gave a quick look behind her to see who was following, only to be greeted by the silhouette of a tall man only a few meters away and closing in quickly. The man did not appear to be wearing any protection despite the freezing temperature. The lack of lampposts made it difficult for my mom to make out anything else. That's not what scared my mom the most, though. She was eventually chased into an area that was lit by a dim light mounted to the side of a merchant's stall. When she looked back, she was able to see her pursuer was carrying a large plank in his hand. Now petrified, she continued to run and refused to look back again. Suddenly, she saw the light of a lamppost that was situated on a small street nearby. Luckily, at that very moment, there happened to be a young couple walking right towards her. With her last ounce of energy, my mom ran right up to them and collapsed in front of them. My mom was in absolute hysterics. When they asked her what was wrong, she explained to them what happened. By then, though, the stranger had already disappeared back into the darkness. The couple that she ran into happened to be living on the same apartment block as her and was familiar with her father as well. They accompanied her on the journey back home, and they told my grandfather where they'd found her. After the couple left, my mom couldn't stop crying out of shock and fear. From then on, my grandfather would always meet my mom at the bus stop where she got off at, and they would walk home together. My mom never found out who her mysterious assailant was, but thankfully she never had another encounter with the man again. I live way out in the country in Ohio, actually. My husband and I moved out here shortly after we were married. It was how I wanted to live. It was at least an hour drive away from town. There were other neighbors on the ridge too, but we were all set very far apart. Generally, they were all down long dirt roads that were connected to one main road. Our house was on top of a hill, up a small dirt road that was about 100 yards away from that main road. Honestly, most of the roads really only served as long driveways because they led to one house. Ours wasn't as long as some of the others, and you could see the main road from our front door. That was pretty normal for the area. My husband worked on a boat on the Ohio River and would often be gone for days at a time. It didn't really bother me though, as I had a lot of time to myself and he made some pretty good money. Plus, whenever he was not working, that meant we had a lot more time to spend with each other. One night, being the night before my husband would be coming home, I was watching a movie with my daughters. It was in October, and the sun had been down for a couple of hours now. While we were watching the movie, I heard a sudden knock at our front door. We all looked at each other, because this was very odd. We never locked our doors at that time. The only people who would ever come here would generally just walk right in. I went ahead and opened the door. Standing on my porch was this dirty man who looked like he was in his 30s. He was dressed in ragged clothing, had a dirty brown beard, and completely bloodshot eyes. When I saw the man, I asked him how I could help him. Yeah, could you tell me how to get back to the main road?" the man said, looking very uncomfortable. That question obviously made no sense to me. You could see the main road right from where we were standing. It was only 100 yards away, but this man was acting like he was lost in the jungle. My husband was away from home, though. I really didn't want to point out the stupidity of this man's question and risk pissing some stranger off. I pointed back down the driveway and the man thanked me. He walked over to this dirty old Pinto he must have been driving, hopped in and drove away. The next day when my husband came home, I told him about what had happened. He figured it was probably just some wino who was too drunk to know where he was. I hadn't remembered smelling any alcohol on him, but I figured my husband must have been right. I tried my best to put it out of my mind. About a week later, when my husband was again gone, I was watching a movie with my daughters at night once more when I heard a familiar knock at the door. We went to answer it. To my alarm, it was that same man from the previous encounter. Now I was mildly unnerved, but I tried not to let it show. Again, I asked what I could do for him. "Yeah, sorry, could you tell me how to get back to the main road?" he asked, looking very uncomfortable. It was all too obvious this man was unbalanced. Either that, or he was up to something. I figured if my ploy had worked the first time, though, it might work the second time as well. I pointed down the driveway and turned away. The man thanked me, hopped right back in his car, and drove off as swiftly as possible. Well, my husband and I were quite concerned this time, but we didn't really know what we could do about it. He hadn't done anything illegal per se, just weird. We started locking the doors from then on. I wanted my husband to stay home from work, but it was nearly impossible for him to get time off around this time. Instead, the next time he left, he had his nephew Todd come over and keep us company instead. Well, that night came and Todd came over like we expected. A couple of hours after sunset, we heard a knock at the door once more. This time, Todd went. Todd was a very big guy, 6'3" and a good 200 pounds or so. He opened the door and the strange man was standing there. He looked very surprised to see Todd. He composed himself immediately, though, and started to ask his same question. "Yeah, could you tell me how to get back to the—" Todd cut him off. He told the man he didn't know what the hell his problem was, but he'd better quit coming to our house and bugging us with this stupid question over and over, or else he would make him regret ever coming back. The man, who had previously looked very nervous every time he came to the door, suddenly didn't look nervous at all. He stood up straight, and with lightning-fast reflexes, grabbed a knife out of his jacket and made to stab. He caught Todd good on the arm, and Todd fell backwards. I was close enough by the door that I was able to slam it in the man's face and lock it luckily. He looked in through the window and began to tap his knife against it a few times. He smiled at me as he tapped it once more. He walked over to the front window of the house and looked inside. The man smiled all the while as he curved his head to look at me in front of the door. After a moment, he came back to the door and began to tap his knife against it repeatedly. This completely freaked me out. I finally got up the courage to ask him what he really wanted. Yeah. Could you tell me how to get back to the main road?" the man asked once more. I was completely thrown off. It was the strangest situation I'd ever been in. After what had just happened, he went right back to pretending to be some innocent stranger. I kneeled down beside Todd as my daughters ran to call 911. I simply pointed down the main road through the window. The man thanked me through the door, walked over to his car, and drove away. He never came back after. I have no explanation for the man's weird behavior, and the police never caught him either. Other than the answer to his question, I have no idea what he wanted. But it's the fact that I don't know that's the scariest part of this whole thing. My dad was a bit of an ass. That's really the nicest thing I could ever say about that jerk. He was always drunk, and whenever he did get drunk, he became 10 times the ass he was beforehand. It was even worse when my mom left. We remained with this man, who was completely unfit for being a father. While I might seem like I'm exaggerating, trust me, I'm really not. He'd use us kids to try and make our mother miserable, which of course only made us miserable too. We grew up in the city, and as kids, we were used to that lifestyle. Our father, however, had this strange fascination with living out in the country. He wanted to move us out to be as far away from people as possible. Like everyone else, he had his dreams about what he wanted to do way out in the country, but they were all just things he talked about when he was drunk. It was all make-believe that he believed he would do anything other than lift up a bottle. I was 12 when he eventually did move us out into the country, to a very rural area in Ohio. It was no less than a 45-minute drive to the nearest town. It really sucked, because it meant that even for the simplest of things, my brother and I would have to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and walk nearly 2 miles to the nearest school bus stop, then wait for the damn bus ride, which was over an hour and a half to get to the school. To demonstrate what an ass my dad was, the bus driver was actually required to drive up the road to our house, but being that our house was the only one on the road he had to stop at, my dad told him that we could just walk to the main road every morning instead. As was usual for this jerk, he made our lives hard in order to make some stranger's life easier. I don't want to get off on too much of a dad-hating rant though. It'll get way off the point of the story if I do. I'll tell you now about the freakiest thing that ever happened to me. When we lived out there, my dad and brother were restoring an old Mustang. After they got it running, my dad took it out for a ride one day. He went much further down the gravel route that we lived on. We were at the top of the hill, and the route went up and down many hills. There were no houses for miles around. In fact, when we drove further out that way ourselves, it would take at least 30 minutes of driving to find anything. It was about as rural as you could possibly get. On this particular day, my dad decided to take that car out for a test drive, and he was gone for a very, very long time. Many hours afterwards, he came back to the door and looked winded. Apparently, the battery had died far from the house, and he'd had to walk all the way back home. Of course, he immediately grabbed a beer and sat down on his lazy side and told me to go grab the jumper cables. When I did, he told me to take the cables to the car and wait for someone to come by and ask for a jump. When I tried to protest, he told me that he had been out there long enough, and I had to do it simply because he told me to. Now, you're probably thinking, why would he send a 13-year-old out to do that? I'd had a birthday while we lived there. He had insisted when we moved out there that I learned how to drive, and now it seemed he wanted to put me to the test. Anyhow, I grabbed those cables and went out to the car. It was already dusk by the time I arrived there. I knew it would be getting quite cold as well, so I got into the car to stay warm. It didn't take very long at all for it to get pitch black, and by the time it was dark, not a single car had come by. Honestly, I didn't even expect one to. I can't tell you how long I stayed there in the dark in that car, at a complete loss as to what to do. I could hope a car would eventually come by this lonely road, but I really doubted they ever would. It's not like I could walk back home in this dark anyway. I figured I would have to just keep on waiting. After a while, I thought I saw something up on the hill. Just a little flicker of light. I dismissed it at first even. It may have just been some lightning bugs or fireflies. After a period of time though, I saw it once more. It seemed to be getting closer before disappearing again. The next time I saw it, I began to get slightly concerned. When the light finally got a bit closer, I could see it seemed to be another person. I squandered my breath. Although I would have welcomed a car to give me a jump, someone walking alone in the woods at this time of night was not someone I wanted anything to do with. As a precaution, I manually locked the doors of the car and lowered myself down into the seat. I remained there in that car for a while, trying to be quiet and remain unnoticed. I guess it was kind of silly, because even if I wasn't seen, it would look weird with an abandoned car just sitting out there. At least 30 minutes had passed at this point. I thought I was in the clear. I began to wonder what I was going to do next, when I began to hear it, a tapping noise. I looked over to the driver's window to see what it was coming from. At first, I saw nothing. Then I saw 2 fingers slowly rise from underneath into view as they tapped on the window before retreating down once more. Whoever this was, they must have decided to mess with me. I waited for a while, looking at the passenger window for a bit, wondering what was going to happen next. After a while, I finally saw 2 fingers emerge. They looked like they were about to walk along the window tapping, but they stopped. I heard the tapping again, only this time it was behind me. I jumped out of my skin, since my back was facing that door. I saw a second hand sneaking out from underneath. Apparently, the people who were out there were extremely amused because I could now hear some raucous laughing. I kept an eye on both windows as well as I possibly could, for the hands now began to tap simultaneously on both of them. Completely freaked out, I lowered myself into the seat as far as I could and tried to find a weapon somewhere on the floor. I reached around for a bit, and finally, with a breath of relief, my hand closed in on a tire iron. My relief didn't last very long though, because while the 2 pairs of hands were still tapping on the side windows, I saw a figure stand up from beneath the hood in front of the car. A third person. Not knowing what the hell to do, I reacted on instinct and tried flashing the lights on the guy in front of me. I was very surprised when they actually came on. They didn't just come on though, they completely lit up. When I pulled them back, the high beams came on too. Well, color me shocked. I put the key in the ignition and the damn car started up perfectly. In the moment, I didn't want to think about why my dad had tricked me. I just put the car into drive and hit the gas. Actually, I hit the guy in front of me, who wasn't able to get out of the way in time. It wasn't a hard hit though, since he was right in front and I didn't have time to build up speed. I didn't really care anyways though. These guys were threatening me, and whatever they got, they deserved. I floored it and did not stop until I got home. Now, remember when I told you my dad was an asshole? Well, as soon as I got home, he was laughing his ass off because it had taken me so long to figure out the car was never dead to begin with. It had been an idiotic joke. When I told him what happened, he swore up and down he had nothing to do with those other people. I don't know though. I think a man who would send his son out for such a bad practical joke to begin with doesn't get the benefit of the doubt. He's such an asshole. Let me preface this by saying I work in a well-populated town with a low crime rate, and no reason to outright assume any of these actions were what I later found out to be sex attempts. I work at a popular coffee chain, generally doing afternoon and closing shifts. This night in particular, we had a very young crew for the closing, which happened at 10:30 p.m. We had our shift lead, 19 and female, who we'll call Sarah, myself, 17 and female, and my co-worker, 17 and female as well, who we'll call Mia. There was also another girl called Dee there. It had been a relatively slow night with only a few loyal regulars dropping by. Both the drive-thru and cafe were empty, as heavy rainfall had started, and no one wanted to be out. I was in the front of the store cleaning, while the rest of my co-workers were in the back. An old man walked inside. He wore odd clothing, which was a bit strange for the humid weather. Full black attire with combat boots, a heavy red jacket, and a beanie obscuring his hair. I brushed it off as protection from the storm and figured he must work outside or something. I went to ask if he had placed an online order as he stood at the mobile counter. Putting on my best customer service voice, I smiled and went through my standard spiel. I was alarmed when, instead of responding, he placed a bag on the counter and started pulling out some DVDs. Once he finished pulling out a stack of 10 or so, he stared past me into the back room, where my co-workers were obliviously chatting. Then he began to make a lap around the store, eyeing me the entire time and not saying a word. Eventually, he backed out the front door and walked out to his truck, which I could now see was a large black pickup. Freaked the hell out by this behavior, obviously, I stupidly grabbed the stack of DVDs and ran back to my coworkers. They were immediately alarmed by my demeanor and asked me what was wrong. I held out the DVDs and let them inspect them while I explained what I had witnessed. Much to my discomfort, Sarah pointed out that all these movies seemed to be about either murders or kidnappings. Pissed off and feeling weird, we decided to call my manager. He picked up and Sarah explained the situation, while I comforted Dee and Mia, who were freaked out, probably more so than me at the time. Still though, there was nothing we could really do about it, except to call back if anything else happened. We hung up and moved back to the front of the store as a group. Things went on as usual, but now there was an air of fear about us. Mia stuck to my side and Dee to Sarah's. The man's truck had clearly pulled away earlier, but much to my dismay, I could see it had now pulled into the closed grocery store next door. As well, it seemed to have a clear view into the drive-thru window. A few cars pulled into the drive-thru in the meantime. I even had a few customers ask if I was alright, due to what I assumed to be my terrified face. I've always had a pretty good intuition about things. This felt more wrong than anything else I'd ever felt. More time passed by, and now it was time for Dee to leave. I could see the man was still waiting in the parking lot next door. We decided it would be best to call her boyfriend instead of letting her go out on her own. This wasn't an irregular occurrence, and we didn't want the man to follow her or something. Mia also noticed that a van had been sitting in back of the parking lot for almost an hour at this point, which none of us had noticed previously. Another gut feeling hit, and I made the decision to now lock the door. Dee's boyfriend, Daniel, told her he was on the way, and I informed my manager we had locked the cafe for peace of mind. He was fine with that as business had been so slow that night. Sarah and Dee were in the back now. Mia and I were up front. I went about cleaning the machines and trying to make idle chatter to keep us calm, which was no small feat. She jumped up every time she heard someone steaming milk or something. As we were talking and I had my back turned to her, she screamed mid-sentence, "Get out!" Alarmed, I whipped around, only to see a shadowy figure attempting to climb in through the drive-thru window. The next few moments were a blur of adrenaline-rushed thinking, and what I can only explain as extreme divine intervention. Grabbing her arm, I yanked Mia behind me. I grabbed the hot bucket of sanitizer I had been using to scrub the counters around the machines, and poured the liquid onto the man. I simultaneously used the bucket to smack the man and push him out the window, which he only had his shoulders through so far. I slammed the bucket down on his head, too. At the same time, Daniel happened to pull up outside. Mia was now yelling for someone to call the police. I saw Dee in my peripheral, running outside to her new savior. I slammed the drive-thru window shut and locked them up, with the man still laying on the ground struggling to get his bearings. I couldn't tell you how much time had passed. Couldn't have been more than 15 or 30 seconds. I saw Daniel rush the man, who was now on his knees, and pin him to the ground. Sarah and Mia were now pulling me back to the back of the store, with both fighting back sobs, and Sarah on the phone with the police. Thankfully, some of our regulars happened to be deputies, and they arrived within 5 minutes of our call. They arrested the man, too. The aftermath was messy. They eventually pinned him as a member of a local trafficking ring that had been caught years prior and let out on bail. Oh yeah, the van in the back that we had noticed, it hightailed it out of the parking lot immediately as soon as the police arrived. Eventually, it was traced back to people who were also part of that ring. Even though I won't be releasing names or such as legal proceedings are still happening, I figured I would share my story here. I still work there and I'm very grateful for Daniel, who very well could have saved all our lives in that moment. He managed to keep the man pinned the entire time until police arrived and disarmed him. Really the true hero of this story, although I do pride myself on my quick thinking for managing to shove the man out of the store. Moral of the story is trust your gut feelings and always have a steaming hot bucket of sanitizer on hand. This is a story from around 10 years ago. I was 16 or 17 at the time. At the time, I kind of brushed this off because nothing bad ended up happening to me. I tried to put it down to, I guess shit just happens to you when you're a woman walking alone at night. But looking back, I realized how creepy it really was. I was coming home on my own on a Thursday night after being out at the pub with some friends. We had been out a little more centrally in the city, so I had to take a bus on my own to get home to my residential neighborhood. I had done this route hundreds of times before, so I didn't see it as being particularly dangerous, especially as I lived in a fairly nice neighborhood. It was only around 11 p.m., but because I lived in a residential area and it was in the middle of the working week, as I got off my bus at my stop, it was absolutely dead, not a single soul around. This didn't really spook me though. It was only about a 5 to 10 minute walk from the stop to my house. As I turned down a long residential street that led towards my home, I noticed a man walking a bit further down the street. This put me a little bit on edge, but I was reassured by the fact that he had his back turned toward me and was also walking away from me down the street. Probably just a random guy getting home as well or something. I kept on walking when I noticed the man suddenly turn around and clock his eyes on me. That was kind of strange, I thought. I guess though that I always did turn around as well when I heard someone walking behind me at night, so not really anything weird by that. I noticed though as we got further and further down the street that he kept on doing this, checking that I was still walking in the same direction as him. At this point I was starting to get pretty freaked out, particularly as I was now painfully aware we were the only two people around. Just as I was weighing what I should do though, he turned down the path of one of the houses to our right, and I breathed a big sigh of relief. So the man really was going to his house. I was just being paranoid the whole time. Heck, maybe he even thought I was following him. The houses in my area are terraced, with the front doors being kind of embedded into an enclave at the front of the house. This means that from where I was standing, I couldn't actually see the man entering the house as it was obscured by a wall. I did see him walk down the path and disappear into the front door enclave though, so my logical conclusion was that this must be his house. I can't exactly describe what made me feel like this, but after that initial feeling of relief wore off, I suddenly got this very bad feeling. I stopped walking and just kind of stood there. There was this tiny voice in my head that said, "What if he's just trying to fake you out?" The feeling became so strong that I stepped off the pavement and ducked down to hide behind a parked car and just kind of waited there. After about 10 minutes of crouching behind this car staring at the home, I saw movement and my heart stopped. The man came back down the path, out onto the street, and was obviously looking around searching for me. He must have been waiting for me in that doorway, knowing that if I kept on walking, I wouldn't be able to see him until it was too late. Unfortunately for him though, his hiding place also meant he couldn't see me. When I hadn't walked past him as he'd anticipated, he came back out into the street to try and work out where I had gone. Looking back now, I probably should have called the police at this point, but as a scared teenager, my fight-or-flight brain took over. I sprinted down one of the roads running perpendicular to the street we were on, as I knew I could use it to take a slightly longer route home. I didn't stop running until I finally arrived home. I quickly double-locked the door behind me. Amazingly, I didn't even think I woke anyone in my family up. I just ran up to bed, then woke up the next morning and went to school like nothing ever happened. I dread, though, to think what might have happened if I hadn't suddenly felt that bad feeling and stopped walking. Part of me thinks, on some subconscious level, my brain must have registered not hearing the front door shut or something after the man had approached it. I wasn't really consciously thinking of this at the time, but I really learned my lesson to trust your gut. I grew up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. My family moved out there when I was about 6 months old. I was originally born in a small town called Mount Clemens, the same town that Dean Cain from The Adventures of Lewis and Clark was born in. I suppose that's my biggest claim to fame. Michigan is quite a unique state in the way it's positioned on the northern border of the US and the southern border of Canada. Those of us who are born in Michigan usually stay here, and no one ever travels to my neck of the woods. There's no real way to just pass by. We're landlocked by the Great Lakes, if that makes sense. With the exception of the large cities, the state is mostly covered by various woodlands. I have a few strange experiences living in the Upper Peninsula, but none is stranger than the one I'm about to tell you. We lived on top of a hill about a 30-minute drive to the nearest town. Our next-door neighbors were a good 10 or so miles away. It was quiet, and few if any vehicles ever came by our house. Because of that, I developed a strange fear of vehicles coming up the hill. It seemed like you could hear them coming from miles away. I mean, of course there were others who lived on our road, but this wasn't a place for outsiders to take shortcuts or something. We didn't even have names on our roads. They were all designated by simple numbers. As I got older, I wasn't as scared of the vehicles passing by during the day. I knew that most of the cars and trucks that went by were distant, friendly neighbors. When night came, well, that was a different story altogether. I could see the headlights cutting through my bedroom window and lighting up my walls like some kind of ominous paint job. It's a hard feeling to describe, but in my young mind, I felt that no one had any business driving down such a remote road at any point after dark. At the time this happened, I was 13. The year was 1996. Our family had amazingly just acquired the internet. Anyone in their mid to late 30s knows how insane this time was. For whatever reason, at this time, my dad installed a sliding glass door on the wall near where the computer was. The computer used to be the hub of our home at the time. That's unlike nowadays, where every family member has their own personal computer, plus a billion other gadgets in their pocket. So having the sliding door open up to the scenery of the countryside from the computer desk was actually a nice and appreciated gesture. Well, I appreciated it for all of about 2 days, before one of the strangest things I've ever seen occurred. I was up late on a Saturday night on the computer, like usual. In those days, I was probably messing about in Yahoo chat rooms, or maybe playing some Myst. That was when I heard it, mostly felt it at first. The low rumbling of a truck's engine creeping slowly down the main road. The truck passed by our house, then stopped. The long-forgotten fear I mentioned earlier came roaring back to life in an instant. Nothing good could come from such a suspicious vehicle driving down our road at 1 o'clock in the morning. What I saw next has burned itself inside my head. I can recall it as clear as day. The truck screeched to an immediate stop. A man threw open the passenger side door and quickly hustled over to the driver's side. This was all taking place too far away for me to give a really good physical description, but I could tell the passenger was much larger than the driver. He was wearing some kind of puffy vest jeans and one of those trucker-style caps. He grabbed the driver and dragged him out of the truck. He then slammed him against the tailgate. He seemed to be screaming at him and ordering him to do something. He motioned for him to open the tailgate. When he did, I saw the driver turn to the bigger guy as if he was hesitating out of fear. Even at a distance, I could clearly see this guy was unnerved. His partner forcefully handed him a shovel. The passenger then pointed to a spot on the side of the road behind the truck. The panicked driver began to frantically dig where the passenger had pointed to. He dug for about 3 or 4 minutes, paused, and then looked back at the driver. The two exchanged some words I couldn't quite make out. They then dragged something out of the bed of the truck. I could only describe it as looking like a closed sleeping bag, with a body obviously still inside. The passenger walked over to the shallow grave and tossed it in. The two men then made a poor attempt at covering up the hole before they sped away in a hurry. You may be asking, well, did you go out and see what they buried there? The answer is surely what you would expect. Of course I did. That's the creepiest part of it all. When I went out to the road the next morning, the hole was empty. I knew what I saw was real because the tire tracks were still there from the night before, but whatever they'd thrown into that hole was now gone. I looked to the opposite side of the burial and was horrified to see footprints in the dirt leading straight out into the forest. I had no idea what to make of all this. I've repressed this memory for so long, and I just wanted to pretend like it never happened. Aside from a few close friends, I never told anyone about this. I believe that bag they tried to bury in the ground had someone in it. They must have thought the person was dead. However, based on what I saw the next morning, clearly they were wrong. You can chalk this all up to teenage imagination if you like, but I stand by what I said. There are some things you'll see in this world that you'll never be able to explain, and even if you could, chances are you wouldn't much like the answer. My dad owned a small house for a brief amount of time. This particular house was not one that he lived in, though. He bought the place to renovate and resell it for a profit. This house was on a dead-end street out in the woods. It was a very private location, but the road had a history of people dumping things off or abandoning stolen vehicles there. There were only 2 houses on that street. This house was often used by drifters. A neighbor told us it had been a drug house for a long time. A few months after my dad bought the house, he called me to ask if I would meet him there to help him unload some materials. I arrived about 10 minutes before he did, and I noticed that there was already a car in front of the house. I decided to go investigate to see if there was anyone in the car. I saw that there was clothing piled up in the back seat. As I walked around this car, I started to have this uneasy feeling that I was not alone. I could hear someone out moving in the woods near the house. I went and stood at the edge of the woods for several minutes, watching and waiting. My dad arrived a short while later with his trailer in tow. He got out of his truck and walked over to the car. I told him I had a feeling that whoever owned this vehicle was still close by, and that I'd heard someone walking around in the woods before he got there. He looked over to the car just like I did. Then we both decided to walk through the woods to see if we could find anyone hiding there. As we were walking around, I got the distinct feeling we were being watched by someone. I remember telling my dad how creepy it would be if we actually found a dead body or something. He said he was having the same strange feeling that we weren't alone. The pathway we were on came to a dead end, so we turned back. The car was still there when we returned. We decided to call the police to report the abandoned vehicle. After getting off the phone with them, we went inside the home to check on a few things. We were only inside for a couple of minutes. When we came back out, though, we noticed that the car was already gone. Whoever owned it must have been watching us while we were investigating and decided to take off immediately when we went inside. The police never did show up that night, and we eventually left. Several weeks later, sure enough, a dead body was discovered in the forest right by the home. The person who found the body was a lady who was hiking through the area. There was a neighbor who attempted to tell her about the body before she found it, but that neighbor had a reputation for being a mentally unstable drunk, so no one believed him when he tried to warn them. After the body was found, the police came out to do a report. One of the detectives took a statement from my dad. My dad said the detective was acting quite strange and uninterested, though. I refused to believe that it was just a coincidence that we saw a parked car in that area not long before the body was discovered. As far as my dad knows, they never followed up with the neighbor after the body was found. He had a conversation with him months after this happened, right before he sold off the house. The story gets even stranger. The hiker who found the corpse stated that it looked like it hadn't been there for very long, meaning that it wasn't a rotting heap. She also noted that the head and hands had been removed. The police would later report that the body had been there for years. Something tells me that isn't true. If the body really had been there for years, it would have been nothing but a pile of bones and rot. It all just doesn't add up. It really makes me wonder what could have happened to me or my dad if we had found the driver of the car that day. In summer of 2017, my boyfriend and I were visiting my family before my brother started middle school that August. My parents were watching TV in their room, and I was working on my schoolwork. My brother and boyfriend were playing a video game together in the next room over. They were gracious enough to keep the volume down so I could concentrate on my essay. At around 8:30 p.m., I suddenly remembered I needed to put some gas in my car. Finishing the last paragraph, I called my parents to let them know I would be gone for a few minutes, but I was coming straight back. The gas station was about 10 minutes away from my home, so I would have been back in about 20 minutes or so. I grabbed my keys, kissed my boyfriend goodbye, and left without another word. After 10 minutes of driving, I arrived at the station and pulled up to the nearest pump. As I started pumping the gas into my car, though, an older beat-up truck appeared in the corner of my eye. I turned my head to look and noticed two dark figures just sort of sitting there. I couldn't make out any distinguishing features, but they seemed to be talking while checking out the place. I brushed it off and finished filling up my tank. Before I got back into my car, though, I decided to head into the building to grab some snacks for my boyfriend. I walked inside, quickly picked out some items, and just as I was done making my purchase, two men wearing jeans with black hoodies burst into the store with guns drawn. Both of them appeared to be in their mid-20s and fairly built. "Everybody get on the ground!" the first man shouted. The cashier and everybody else in the store immediately obeyed his orders. There was a few panicked whispers until one of the men shouted at them to shut up. I felt my heart pick up its pace, and my blood ran cold. These men were about to rob this place and possibly shoot up the customers or the cashier. I prayed silently to myself that no one would be killed or seriously injured. One of the men grabbed my hair. "You stand," he commanded. Fearing for my life, I did as he ordered. Almost immediately, I felt an arm snake around my wrist and take hold. I would have elbowed him and stomped his foot, attempted to punch his face even, but I was so paralyzed in fear to think or do anything. The worst part is I felt a gun aiming at the back of my head. I tried squirming away from the man's grip, but he just held me tighter and hissed at me. "Stay still, sweetheart, and no one gets hurt." The other man shouted at the cashier to hand over the cash or to quote, "You're gonna be scraping this brains off the wall." I had no connection with the cashier in any way, except for just being a customer in the store, but I could tell from the look in his eyes he wanted to protect me in any way he could. He was an older guy, possibly in his 60s, with glasses on his face. I knew he had no choice but to comply with their demands. He hastily unlocked the register. As he was handing over the cash, I felt the barrel of the gun press against the side of my head, and I nearly started to freak out. I restrained myself and started to tear up a little. My throat burned from holding it back, all for the sake of keeping myself alive for as long as possible. Once every last dollar bill was in the man's hands, sirens blared from outside. The man then stuffed the money into a backpack, then punched out the cashier. I was thrown to the side, my stomach and arm hitting the edge of the counter. I fell to the floor. As soon as the two men ran outside, they were surrounded by police and within seconds were tackled to the ground and handcuffed. I was still catching my breath, but I was more concerned about the cashier. I pulled myself up and peeked over the counter. For the most part, he seemed to be okay, although I could see his right eye was turning black. His glasses laid broken on the floor. "Are you all right, sir?" I weakly asked him. My stomach was still hurting. "I'm a little blind at the moment, but I'll be okay," he responded. "Is everyone all right?" a familiar voice asked. One of the cops was very good friends with my father. He'd entered the store. "Just us two might need some attention," I said. The officer turned towards us. He immediately recognized me and asked if I was okay. The cashier and I told him everything as other cops came in and questioned the other customers. It turns out a customer had snuck into the bathroom and called 911 without the robbers noticing. Once the questioning had finished, I just couldn't hold it in anymore. I burst into tears, not because I was in pain, but because I had just endured the scariest moment of my life. I just wanted to get home and put an ice pack on my stomach. The cashier was rushed out of the store on a stretcher. The officer asked if I needed any medical attention, but I shook my head and cried that I just wanted to go home. As I walked out of the store, I noticed a few cops investigating the truck I had seen earlier. It then clicked in my head that vehicle belonged to the two men. They must have been scoping the place out, waiting for the right time to strike. I was pretty sure that I was the first person they saw to use as bait. A police car followed me home that night. Eventually, we came to my neighborhood, and my mom ran out of the house and embraced me in her arms. She kept asking me what happened, but I could hardly speak because I was crying so much. Once I was inside, my boyfriend saw me and wrapped me up in his arms. He held me until I calmed down. My dad's friend came in shortly after and explained what happened at the gas station. After the cops left, I was laying on the couch watching TV with an ice pack on my stomach. My brother came in and asked me what happened, but I knew he had to go to bed soon, so I promised I would tell him in the morning. I was still pretty shaken up about what happened, and I didn't want to scare him. I then made a promise to myself that I would never go certain places at night ever again. Well, about 2 years ago, I had my only unpleasant experience ever with trick-or-treating. It doesn't really bother me to talk about it anymore, and I'm more than happy to share it with all of you. I like spooky stories, so I hope you listeners will enjoy this tale. Although I can honestly tell you I did not enjoy it very much when it happened to me. I'm an 83-year-old widow. Although I miss my husband greatly, when he died a few years ago, I was determined to not become one of those senior citizens who completely lose their identity when they lose their spouse. My husband and I had been married for 52 years, and he was indeed my entire life. After he passed, though, I was able to find a few new things in life I could identify with. I was successful in finding new hobbies and making new connections with new people. One of the things I found I enjoyed more than anything was interacting with trick-or-treaters on Halloween. I have more than a substantial nest egg, so I was able to afford just about anything I could want. When Halloween came around, this meant I went all out with my candy. I'm sure if you've ever been trick-or-treating, you've been happy to find those houses that give away miniature or bite-sized candy bars. Kids always love those. Well, I put those in the dust. I gave out full-size, you name them. Reese's Peanut Butter Cups, full bags of M&Ms, giant Milky Ways, and of course most popular of all, the Snickers bars. Nothing made me happier than seeing the looks on children's faces or imagining them under the mask when I'd give them the best trick-or-treat candy in the entire neighborhood. On the Halloween night of this particular story, it was pretty typical for a Halloween night, honestly. I had lots of candy and what seemed to be an endless supply of children stopping by my home for some bars. It was well known in the neighborhood that I had a strict policy of one per trick-or-treater. All the children knew this, so no one ever tried to get more than one. As the night went on though, for the first time ever, I was positive I saw a child come back around for another piece of candy. Sure, children do wear similar costumes, but everything about this person seemed to indicate I'd seen him before. His costume was a melange of characters. He was short, about 4 feet tall, and had on a hockey mask, a part of a pirate costume, and carried his plastic jack-o'-lantern in what looked like a cheaply made Freddy Krueger glove. Needless to say, it was very unlikely any 2 children would have constructed such a makeshift costume. This was the first time in years I'd actually had a trick-or-treater try to cheat the system and grab an extra piece. Still though, he's just a kid, so I let it slide and gave the lad a second bar. It was quite possible it was someone different and the costume was some sort of trend or perhaps based on some new scary movie character I didn't know about. Honestly, I was impressed with the effort as well. Jason from Friday the 13th, Freddy Krueger, those were the 2 most modern characters I knew about. About 20 minutes after the boy had come back for the second bar, a child seeming near identical to him came back around for a 3rd time. This time, I was absolutely positive it was him. This time, he was with a different group of kids, carrying the exact same purple jack-o'-lantern bucket he'd had the previous 2 times. When he came up to me, I looked inside and saw he only had those 2 full-size candy bars in the bucket. Now, young man, I already broke my rule for you once and gave you an extra bar. I wagged my finger at him. It wouldn't be fair if I gave you another one, now would it? The boy didn't answer. He just continued to hold his bucket out, expecting a 3rd piece of candy. When I told him I couldn't give him anything else because it wouldn't be fair to the other kids around, the boy set his pumpkin down on my porch. He took his hand with the Freddy Krueger glove and brandished the blades at me. He waved the individual fingers one by one. Now, no need to get like that. You've already had 2 bars. Run along now, child. He paused for a moment. The boy then took his hand and actually swiped the glove at me. It caught on my arm, and to my surprise, it actually cut me. Luckily, he hadn't managed to slice me very deep. The glove had looked so cheap, probably because it was a real one that he had made himself with the real knives he had found. I screamed in pain and dropped the bowl of candy on the ground as I grabbed my now bleeding arm. The boy began to scoop out the candy of my bowl and slam it into his bucket. After finishing taking everything, he looked up at me and lifted his mask. I could see this person was not a child at all. He was a short man, unshaved, and his face seemed to look like he was in his 40s. He smiled at me, and I could see he had at least 1 gold-capped tooth in his smile. He lowered his mask once more and ran off giggling. The cuts were superficial, so that at least was good, but the experience itself was rather traumatic. Fortunately, the police caught the guy not long after. It seemed he had been doing this to other houses in another town before, so I was lucky that way, I guess. When you're short with 1 gold tooth in a small town, you tend to stand out in the crowd. They caught him, and I'm much happier that way. I still give out candy bars and still enjoy trick-or-treaters. However, now when someone asks me for a second bar, I just give it to them. I love Halloween. It's my favorite holiday of the year without question. I love everything about it. I love the ghost stories, monsters, scary movies, and I love graveyards as well. At least, I used to love them. Back in high school, I had an experience that soured me just a bit on cemeteries. During October, I used to always play games of hide and seek with my friends. Well, we didn't call it hide and seek though. We called it Ghost in the Graveyard. We broke into the local cemetery and played behind the gravestones. The person who was it was obviously the ghost, and he would start out in the center of the graveyard. There was a large monument there that was placed on the grave of one of the richer people in town who had died quite some time ago. We had no idea who he was, but he must have been loaded because that was a huge monument. The others would spread out and hide behind the gravestones in the graveyard. We used the entire cemetery, so there was plenty of room for us to hide. This meant that one round of the game could last for a really long time. When the ghost found you and he had to actually see you, first you had to run back to the monument in order to be safe. If you were caught though, you didn't become it necessarily. We said that you died and sat out the next round. The people who made it back to base would go again. This would of course continue until everyone died, and the last person to die got to pick who would be the ghost for the next round. I was 16, and we were playing the game on Halloween night. It was a very cold night out. It was so cold I had to wear a jacket and even a thick pair of gloves. I was actually in a bit of a good mood, because there was this girl named Angela who was tagging along with us. As you might have guessed, I was really interested in Angela, so I was trying to show off a bit. You know, running as fast as I can. During the early rounds, I even jumped over some high gravestones, trying to show off clearing them easily. I would strut around the base, rubbing it in the nose of the ghost that he could never catch me. Looking back, I was acting like a complete dumbass, but I was really hoping to get somewhere with Angela. After about 4 rounds of the game, only me and one of the guys were left uncaught. Angela had gotten killed in the first round, so she just remained on base and watched me easily escape the ghost each time. There was no doubt in my young mind, by the end of this night that girl would want me bad. Well, during the 5th round, I went way out into the graveyard. I wanted to last as long as possible, to really show off my hiding prowess, so I went over a hill past some trees and found this small tomb. It was a wonderful hiding place. The only bad thing about hiding there was that it was so cold outside. I was having some trouble keeping myself warmed up, even through my jacket and gloves. I was just standing there shivering. It took nearly 15 minutes before I finally heard the ghost approaching me. He was not quiet at all, and the ground was covered in dry leaves, so I could hear him as he was getting nearer to me. Now I know what you're thinking reading this. You think I was not hearing the ghost and it was actually someone else. But that's not what was going on. I heard the ghost talking and trying to coax me out of my hiding place, and I knew that voice. It was the voice of my buddy, who had failed to grab me all the previous rounds. I tried moving into a position in which I could sprint more easily once he found me. Unfortunately, my movement caused a shuffling in the leaves, and I heard the noise of my buddy's feet stop. I cursed my mind for giving away my position. I heard the footsteps begin again, and they were coming right towards me. My buddy was whistling at this point. I couldn't just run though, because the ghost had to actually spot you before you could go away. And that was why the element of surprise was so important in this game. I heard my breathing speed up, and I braced myself to jolt past right when he found me. Now he was getting closer. I heard him. I put my hands up and got into a starting position. He was almost upon me. I leaned forward in anticipation. My buddy, the ghost, came around the side of the tomb, looked right past me, then turned around and ran away. Needless to say, I was completely confused. Slowly, I turned around, and I saw the most hideous woman I'd ever seen, sitting right behind the tomb right next to me. Who knows how long she had been there, watching me. She had this dirty red hair, and her face was covered with I don't know what. Must have been herpes or something. It was nasty. She leaned in and whispered into my ear, "Hey, sexy." She grabbed my foot as I tried to bolt away. Screaming, I begged for the ghost to come back and help me, but he was not about to turn around. The lady had an extremely firm grip on my shoe. She was surprisingly strong. I tried to shrug her off, but before I could even do much, she grabbed the back of my pants. She got a handful of my belt, the waistband of my jeans, and even the waistband of my boxers. She was crying at me, mumbling a bunch of words I couldn't even understand. I tried to pull away from her, but her grip was just way too strong. I tried to kick her, but when I looked back, I could see her holding this little fillet knife. I nearly fished myself. Having no other option to escape this nasty person who wanted God knows what, I undid my belt and zipper. She pulled my jeans and boxers down to my ankles. She had such a good hold on them they came right off easily. I felt her cut my leg with a knife, and then she whispered that she was going to cut it all off. I freaked out and kicked her in the face. My pants and my underwear came off in her grip, naked from the waist down, and with only one shoe. I didn't give a f***. I ran away as fast as I could. It hurt like hell on my feet, of course, and I was absolutely freezing as I ran back to the base. When I arrived, everyone was shocked to see me naked from the waist down. I was so scared, though, I didn't even think to cover myself up at first. Remember how I told you it was very cold outside? Well, by the time I'd actually gotten covered up, everyone, including Angela, had seen the effects of the cold, and it's something I have not lived down to this very day. From then on, my nickname was LD. L stands for little, and you can imagine what the D stands for. I didn't see that woman ever again, but that didn't matter. She did her damage that night. It's ironic that today I've gone into psychology as a profession. When I was a kid, the biggest source of fear I had were stories about insane asylums and escaped mental patients. Today, I deal with psychiatry patients and psychiatric wards in hospitals. The scary world of the criminally insane that children believe in is not really true, but you never could have told me that as a pre-teenager. Now, my dad and my older brother were the type who'd like to try and scare me as much as possible. I don't think they ever truly meant me any harm. They were just the type who enjoyed scaring people late at night and thought that was very normal. I remember such things as the time when my brother bought a Freddy Krueger glove and hid underneath my bed, then extended his hand out from underneath to grab me. That almost made me wet the bed. There was also that time we were watching Child's Play, and he threw one of my baby dolls at me halfway through the film. By far the worst one for my brother that I can remember, though, was when I was watching a zombie movie with my friends. I was sitting on the couch by the window. Unbeknownst to me, he'd taken the screen out and reached in to grab my shoulders, then groaned brains. I screamed, jumped off the couch, and ran up the stairs in 3 strides to make it to my room. He had a very good laugh over all those pranks, and after getting over the initial annoyance, I had to admit they were somewhat good jokes. When I was 14, my dad finally bought a house out in rural Virginia. Being someone that had been used to living in northern urban areas, I was not very pleased. I also wasn't very happy with the house itself either. It was very old and unkempt as well. My dad was always the type to buy fixer-uppers, then never actually try to fix them up. This meant it was just an old house and was not going to be likely any better than it had been when we'd first gotten it. I wasn't very familiar with the area either. When I asked my dad why he'd chosen to move there, he told me it was because he'd gotten a good deal on the house. I continued to ponder why he'd gotten such a good deal on a house in the country. He told me no one wanted to live there because of an old insane asylum kept out in the hills. People were always worried that escaped prisoners would break into their houses and do hideous things to their families. Nowadays, looking back, I know that's complete nonsense, but I was a teenager with a healthy fear of mental patients, so I really believed that could happen. Being given the choice for the rooms in the house, I chose an odd windowless room that was set slightly lower than the rest. I liked it because it had no windows. There was also one set of 5 steep wooden stairs that led up to the main part of the house. While this may seem like a choice some idiot in a horror film might make, I actually had a valid reason. Without windows down there, I wouldn't have to worry about who might be peeping in on me. I could put my bed across the room from the stairs and always keep an eye on the only way in and out. As a plus as well, the stairs creaked so loudly when anyone walked on them. It was no chance anyone was going to come down and surprise me. The floors were very old hardwood that creaked so loudly no matter how softly you walked on them, you could never be quiet. Practically, though, this meant that I would always know whenever my dad or brother were coming in to try and scare me. Yeah, you're probably thinking I'm a wuss. Listen to this, though. I'd rather be overly cautious and living than be an idiot who hears a noise in the next room and investigates to get killed. For the most part, it was less a matter of protecting myself from mental patients than letting my dad or brother surprise and scare me, though. I guess for anyone listening who has a family that doesn't enjoy frightening them for no reason, you might not understand what I mean. Well, we lived in the house for a while without incident. My family kept up with the stories about the asylum, but they became less and less scary over time. The nights went by without anything ever actually happening. I came to the conclusion that that whole asylum thing had just been made up. Late one night in July, about 4 months after we had moved in, I was just laying in my room reading a book. I tended to stay up rather late, much later than the rest of my family actually. At about 1 o'clock in the morning though, I finally decided to get some rest. Stage 1 sleep is what we call that period of time when you first begin drifting off. You know what I mean, the time when you never remember anything unless something brings you out of it. In that time your mind thinks weird things you won't remember in the morning. Well, something brought me out of my sleep. I wasn't quite sure what it was at first. I knew I must have heard something, but I had no idea what it could possibly be. I heard it once more though, a creaking noise, the very distinct creak one would hear if someone were walking down some old wooden stairs. My heart felt like it stopped for a moment. It actually felt like it paused, as a million things rushed through my head. My first instinct was to turn on the lamp by my bedside right away. The sound was coming from the stairs, so if I could get the light on before anyone got all the way down, I'd see who it was. I quickly moved my body over and flipped on the lamp right away. I also jumped out of my bed, causing my own feet to creak as they hit the hardwood floor. Looking over at the stairs exactly where the sound had come from, I saw nothing. I walked very slowly over to the stairwell and looked upward. The door was not only closed still, it was also locked just like I had left it. I paced there for a while, causing the floor to continue creaking. Once I'd calmed down enough, I decided it must have just been the house settling, so I went back to bed. I wasn't necessarily relaxed though. When I turned the lights off, I couldn't drift off into sleep as quickly as I had before. About 15 minutes after I'd laid down, I opened my eyes and looked over at the clock. I sighed. Simultaneously with that sigh though, I heard the noise once more. The same noise coming from the same area. My heart began to race, thinking about what this could possibly be. The noise was once again coming from the direction of the stairwell, but I hadn't heard the door open. I began to think that the sound must be coming from some other part of the house, because no one could have come down there without being noticed. When I heard the creak once more, an unpleasant thought suddenly occurred to me. The sound was coming from the stairs, but those stairs were right beside my closet door. I had checked the closet before going to bed, but if someone had entered my room in the meanwhile, when I would have written it off the first time, they could have easily slipped inside. It had a regular swinging door on it, and I always checked it before going to bed. I heard the sound once more. I flipped over and turned the light on. Then I jumped off my bed, my feet hitting the floor and making a loud, crazy noise for the second time. I wanted anyone who was in there to be aware I was now listening. As I slowly walked over to the closet door, my mind created all sorts of weird images. My imagination was flooded with images of escaped mental patients hiding inside, waiting to attack me. Now, this time, I really felt like an idiot from a horror film, but I knew that if someone was in my closet, there was no way I could just go to sleep now. I approached the door slowly and placed my hand on the knob. I was completely convinced I was going to open that door and see some hideous, deformed maniac sitting on the floor looking up at me with a sick, toothless grin. My heart beat harder and harder in my chest as I held my hand on the knob. I did my best to gather up all the courage I could to rival the heavy beating of my heart. I cleared my mind of all these sick images. I turned the knob until it clicked, assuming it would be better to just get this over with. As I flung the door open, I could see the closet was empty, other than my clothes and shoes. Looking behind everything, I saw my closet was not harboring some insane psychopath. I closed the door and latched it. Then I glanced over at the door on top of the stairwell. That door was locked and latched as well, just like I'd left it. I walked back to my bed mildly worried and extremely confused. I even lowered myself down to my knees and peeked under my bed. It was silly as the noise couldn't possibly be coming from underneath there, but I still had to check. Also empty. I got back into bed and took a bit longer to calm myself down this time. At about 2:15 a.m., I was finally calm enough to try and sleep again. Lying back in bed, I began to fall off into sleep until a sound woke me up once more. Another creaking noise. I turned and looked at the clock. It was now 3:15 a.m., an hour after I'd gone back to bed. The creaking was once again approaching from the stairwell area. My breathing picked up faster, and I wondered if maybe I should just pretend to be asleep this time. I'd hit the floor the previous times to warn any possible intruders I knew they were there. Maybe that was the wrong way to go about this. What changed my mind about pretending to be asleep was the next noise. Not a creaking sound. It was a loud hit and cracking noise that caused my nervous system to almost jump right out of me. For the third time that night, I jumped up and turned on the light, scanning the room. Immediately, I could see what was causing the noises. Coming out of the floor underneath by the stairwell were the blades of what I assumed to be a pair of hedge clippers. It was as if they were being thrust upward through the floor from underneath. They were moving faster than I had ever moved before. I jumped out of bed, cleared the 5 steps in 2 lengths, and ran up to the door screaming. My family all jumped out of bed, and when I told them what happened, I half expected them to tell me they were playing a prank on me. Instead, we heard a loud crack coming from downstairs, and my parents called the police. It might make this story a complete circle if I told you it was a prank or there really was an insane asylum patient. The truth was scary enough without those details, though. A drifter had snuck into the area and gotten into the crawl space, trying to break into the house. They'd chosen my room because there were no windows. He assumed it must be a pantry or a shed. He'd gotten stuck underneath and couldn't bring himself out. He grabbed the clippers to try and get himself out by cutting a hole in the cheap wooden floor. Every time I jumped, he'd heard the creaking of my feet. That's why he stopped and waited for me to go back to sleep. I could try and scare you by telling you the man was an escaped mental patient who had been waiting to torment me and kill me. But that's not true. I could tell you he was a creepy homeless man that wanted to destroy me. What I will tell you, though, is when I asked my dad why the man had taken hedge clippers into the crawl space with him, for the first time ever, he did not try to scare me. A little backstory leading up to this meeting. I grew up in a pretty shady area and would rarely leave home after 7 or 8 p.m. That was around the time it was considered dangerous. Going into high school, I'd also gotten a pit bull. He was a gentle giant who loved everyone and everything. He had some protection work training before he joined our family, but as he was getting older, he'd retired and I took him home with me. On to the actual story. I was around this time a 17-year-old, short, blonde, and very aware of my size. Having a big scary dog along though, I finally felt safe walking alone, and on that very night I set out to take a longer walk with my dog. Let's call him Meatball. He really needed to run off some energy. To do this, I took him out into the woods nearby my home, and we walked along a gravel path that was partially lit. It was around 11 p.m. now, and quite dark outside. As we continued to walk along, I became very aware of the fact there wasn't really anyone else around. We walked for about 10 to 15 minutes, before suddenly a man appeared from behind us. We continued to walk on, and I noticed he was taking the exact same turns as Meatball and I. I sped up a bit, feeling my heart begin to beat fast in my chest. Meatball, who would normally just spend his time sniffing at the end of the leash, also now seemed to be very aware of this situation. He had slowed down to walk beside me, gotten close to my leg, and began to stare at the man. I started to take every turn I could, and the man continued to follow, even though we were now just walking in circles together. He started to gain on us and get closer and closer. I was sure he was after me. I remembered in that moment something my father had once told me. Never let someone follow you. You're most vulnerable from behind. If you get into a situation where you can force your stalker to pass you, do so. I stopped in place and grabbed onto Meatball's leash. I leaned back, acting as if I had to put my entire body weight in just to hold him back. I was aware at this point in my life that I looked very small and weak. My father was an old veteran though, and he'd taught me to fight before I could even walk. Even holding Meatball back was not taking nearly as much effort as it looked. I called out, trying to sound as naive as I could, hoping that if I did have to fight, I would surprise him with my strength. Excuse me, sir, my dog doesn't really like people and I can't really hold him back when he lunges. If I step off to the side, could you pass us by so I have a chance to hold him back? As I said this, Meatball began to bark and growl and snap at the man. He stopped and looked me up and down, then stared at Meatball. He stood there for a few moments before suddenly turning around, not saying a single word. He began to sprint off into the distance. I called my parents and asked them to meet me, as I realized he could easily hide anywhere on our walk back. My dad showed up a few minutes later, baseball bat in hand. Nothing really happened afterward, but after being followed by this man at every turn I took for 40 minutes, I knew this could have ended really badly if I had not had Meatball with me and my dad had not been so close by. When I was 7, I went camping with my parents and baby sister in Virginia. We were staying in a campground specifically, but there were also some cabins available to rent in the area. On the first day there, after constantly protesting for them to allow me to take a walk, my dad complained to my mom that I was old enough to walk the short distance to the park and play without their supervision for a moment. My mom has always been very overprotective and a true warrior, even more so after this camping trip. My mom finally gave in to our combined pleadings and allowed me to go to the campground park. While at the playground, I met a little girl around my own age. We played together for a long while. She was also by herself, so I invited her to come back to our RV to play some Barbies together. We started heading in that direction. On the way back, we crossed paths with my parents, who were going to another family's RV to visit and socialize with them. We let them know that we were going to play Barbies in our RV together. After we'd played for a little while, she suggested we pick up the Barbies and go to the cabin she and her grandparents were staying in to play there. I agreed. The thought never occurred to me that my parents didn't know this girl or her family, or where I would be going. They likely assumed we were going to stay in the RV and play together there the whole time. Now, we played at her cabin for quite a long while. While we played together, her grandparents seemed to be packing up their things, preparing to leave the campground. When they were all packed up and ready to go, they said that they would take me back to the RV on their way there, so I wouldn't have to walk that whole way. Obviously, my parents had always told me to never ever get in the car with a stranger. I knew this, but it just never occurred to me that this was exactly the sort of situation they meant by that. I mean, genuinely, I never felt afraid or concerned even in the slightest about this situation. The little girl's grandparents packed up their car and all of us climbed in. We stopped at the campground's general store, and her grandfather got both of us some ice cream. All I could think about was how this man was so kind and generous. When we got back into the car again, I assumed they would be next dropping me off in the RV. I stayed in the car eating my ice cream and talking with my new friend, completely oblivious to the outside world. All of a sudden, the car stopped abruptly. My dad flew in out of nowhere and threw the door open, tears pouring down his cheeks. He yanked me out of the car and hugged me so hard that I thought I was going to pass out. I was just confused. The car I had just been in then sped away very quickly. It was then that I realized we were all the way at the exit of the campground. Apparently, upon returning to our RV and finding that my new friend and I were gone, my parents had contacted the ranger station, and a lot of people went out to find me. They actually went door to door to different RVs. My dad just happened to be walking by when he saw me in another person's car. I don't know who those people were, but they definitely had no intention at all of bringing me back to my parents. I think the ice cream they bought me was to distract me from noticing details. Over the years, I've often thought back to that day and just how different my life would have been now if it was not for my dad showing up in that exact moment. Had he not seen me just in the nick of time, I might be living a totally different life right now. Just a little bit of background information. I'm a 26-year-old woman, kind of a tomboy. The way I grew up, I was always climbing trees, playing in the dirt, and never even touched a doll or a dress. Back in the summer of 2002, I was 16 at the time. My boyfriend asked me to go on a camping trip with him and his parents. Me being the tomboy I was, I graciously accepted his offer. It sounded like a lot of fun. His parents were planning on a weekend of us going out rafting, boating, swimming, the whole works. I was in absolute paradise. Now, they had an RV, and it was fully furnished as well. I slept in the kitchen and living room area. As a side note, right in the middle of the woods was a designated camping area. It was so quiet and peaceful, you could hear the river in the stillness of the night. It was very soothing. I remember thinking to myself, man, I could live here forever. The next day was probably the funnest day of my life. We went out kayaking together. It was around 1 p.m. My boyfriend's dad decided to have a cookout around that time. I can't remember the last time I lost track of time so much and just enjoyed myself so much the day flew right by. Before I knew it, it was already time for us to go to bed once more. We had a big plan for the next day, and I was eager to get to sleep so I could wake up and have that much fun all over again. I remember laying awake though, just staring at the ceiling. My boyfriend was snoring, and I was laughing as quietly as I could. It was not very loud, but it was somewhat amusing. That was the last laugh I'd have for a long time, though, before my life was literally changed forever. All of a sudden, there was a tapping on the side of the RV. That sound really caught me off guard. I wasn't really alarmed, though. I chalked it up to maybe a random noise, perhaps. You know, maybe an animal or the RV just creaking by itself. I wasn't scared or anything. I tried to sleep it off and just ignore it, but that's when I began to hear an unmistakable giggling sound. I thought that maybe my boyfriend's parents were awake and trying to mess around with us. I listened in a bit closer. Silence washed over the place again, and I could hear the river rushing outside. There was the ringing in my ears as well, the kind you get when there's a real eerie silence. I had this sinking feeling in my stomach that I hear a lot of people get when they think something bad's about to happen. I felt it in that moment. In the dead silence, I heard that giggle again, followed by a scraping sound coming from outside the RV. My heart practically jumped into my throat, and I felt tears in my eyes. Somebody was clearly outside. I was scared stiff, though. I couldn't move a muscle. That scraping sound continued. I whispered to my boyfriend, trying to wake him up, but he just kept on snoring. I heard the sound moving until about 5 feet away from the main door, before there was more silence. My heart was beating so fast I was afraid I was going to have a heart attack. I tapped against my chest, trying to calm myself down. I was just watching the square hole in the door. All of a sudden, I saw a small thing just appear out of the darkness. I almost shrieked out of fear. I could see it appeared to be the hand of a young girl. Looking a bit closer, I could see it appeared to be one of those fake ones you'd get from Walmart, but that didn't stop me from freaking out a lot. I sat up and started screaming. I mean, really started wailing. My boyfriend's parents staggered into the room. All I could do was point at the door. My boyfriend's dad went to open it, but there was a sudden loud crash. He then fell back inside, falling onto the couch out cold. A rock then fell onto the floor. That's when my boyfriend woke up and started shouting. The mom was going insane and turned over to her husband. I was screaming and still in shock. When I finally stopped screaming, I could hear hysterical laughter coming from outside, followed by footsteps on top of the RV. They were up on the roof. I could hear a higher-pitched nasally voice coming from outside the RV. None of us had cell phones in 2002. We were just now starting to get into the cell phone craze, so we were truly in the middle of nowhere, with no way to contact anyone. There would be no help. The RV was now rocking, with somebody obviously jumping up and down on top of it. There was a crash on the side door frame as the man on top smashed it with something. He was screaming and laughing and trying to mock us. That managed to sober us up a bit, though. My boyfriend grabbed a gun from one of the cupboards. He opened the door and fired out into the darkness. The pacing on the roof immediately stopped, and the shrieking outside stopped as well. Everything returned to silence once more. I looked over at my boyfriend. There was a window right behind him. I could see a face in it. I knew it was a man because I could make out the outline of a thick beard on him. That was all I could really see. The man outside raised a gloved hand and started waving at me. I moved my boyfriend away from the window. I looked back and the man was now gone. We drove out of the campsite that night. The RV had suffered a broken window, and my boyfriend's dad had to go to the hospital for a concussion with a rock had hit him in the head. The parents called the police the next morning, and officers went out and searched the area. They couldn't find anything, though. Neither footprints, nor firewood, or anything like that. After that, I had to go through counseling and therapy, because I had quite a bit of trouble sleeping. About 2 years after that, my boyfriend and I actually broke up due to the stress and trauma I was going through because of it. Eventually, I did start to get better, but it took a long time. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with, and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.